Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. You know, there's something I've been thinking about lately. Something that kept circling back in my mind as winter settled in this year, as the first real cold arrived, and I found myself grateful, deeply grateful, for the simple luxury of a heated bathroom just down the hall from my bedroom. We complain about so much, don't we? The heater taking too long to warm up. The walk from the car to the front door feeling too cold. That moment when we have to leave our warm bed in the middle of the night, and even though the bathroom is right there, even though it's warm and lit and safe, we still feel that little surge of reluctance, that resistance to leaving comfort. And yet, there was a time, not so long ago in the grand span of human history, when the simple act of answering nature's call in the middle of a January night could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming just another frozen story that the wind would eventually forget. A cautionary tale whispered around fires, a name that gradually faded from memory because the lesson it taught was too painful to repeat too often. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most history books skip over, not because it isn't important, quite the opposite, actually, but because it's uncomfortable, awkward even. We're going to talk about something so basic, so human, so unavoidable, that every single person who ever lived through a brutal winter had to face it. The question that whispers in the back of your mind when you watch those romantic Old West movies, when you see those pristine winter landscapes in documentaries, when you read those pioneer stories to your grandchildren, when nature called in the middle of a blizzard, when the temperature dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, when snow piled so high that simply walking 10 feet could mean getting lost forever in a white void where up and down lose all meaning. What did they do? How did the Native American tribes of the Great Plains, the northern forests, the Dakotas, the territories that would later become Montana and Wyoming, and the Canadians' provinces beyond, how did they maintain dignity, health, cleanliness, when the world outside their shelter was actively, aggressively trying to kill them, when stepping outside meant entering an environment as hostile to human life as the surface of another planet? This isn't a story about primitive people doing primitive things. That's what we've been told, isn't it? That's the narrative that's been comfortable for us to believe. That our ancestors were crude, simple, unthinking. That they just did what animals do, without thought or system or intelligence. That we're so much more advanced now, so much more civilized, that their struggles and solutions are merely quaint historical footnotes. But what I've learned, what I want to share with you tonight, what has genuinely changed how I see both the past and the present, is something far more beautiful and far more humbling. This is a story about intelligence, deep, patient, multi-generational intelligence, about observation so careful and so thorough that it puts our casual modern awareness to shame, about a kind of wisdom that we've almost completely lost in our world of indoor plumbing and heated bathrooms and water that appears as if by magic when we turn a handle. It's about people who understood the earth so deeply, who watched the wind so carefully, who thought about consequences so thoroughly and so far into the future, that they turned one of humanity's most vulnerable moments into an act of respect, into something that was, in its own way, sacred. Not conquest, not domination, not even really survival in the way we typically think about it. That frantic scrambling to make it through another day. Something quieter than that. Something more sustainable. Something that might teach us more about being human, about being part of a living world, rather than separate from it than we're comfortable admitting. So settle in. Pull that blanket a little closer. Feel the warmth of your room, the safety of your walls, the distance between you and any real danger. Notice how secure you feel, how protected, how insulated from the rawness of the natural world. And let me take you back to a January night on the Great Plains in the year 1780, give or take a decade, to a time when winter wasn't a season you endured from inside a heated house. It was a siege, a test, a months-long examination of everything you knew about staying alive. Let me take you to a place where the wind carries no mercy, and the cold reveals everything, absolutely everything, about who we really are, when the comfortable lies we tell ourselves are stripped away by temperatures that don't care about our stories. Are you ready? Then let's go. Back through the years, back through the fog of civilization and convenience, back to the frozen earth and the dark sky, and the people who knew how to live there. The cold arrives like a living thing, like a presence, like something with intention, not all at once, never all at once. That would be too kind, too quick, too honest. Instead, it seeps, it creeps, it finds every gap in the buffalo hide walls of the teepee, every imperfect seam where sinew stitching couldn't quite close the space between the world of warmth and the world of ice. It's patient, this cold. It has all night. It has all winter. It can afford to be thorough. You're lying on your bed of layered furs, buffalo on the bottom closest to the earth, because buffalo hide is thick and provides good insulation from the ground. Then deer hide, softer, warmer against your body. Then rabbit pelts, dozens of them stitched together, because rabbit fur is surprisingly warm despite the animal's small size. Your grandmother spent an entire autumn preparing these furs, scraping and tanning and softening them until they were perfect, until they could keep you alive through nights like this. And you feel the cold first in your nose, always the nose. The air you breathe becomes sharp, knife-like. Each inhalation a small reminder that the temperature is dropping. Your nasal passages begin to ache with that particular throb that cold brings, that sensation that's not quite pain, but definitely not comfort. You can feel the moisture in your nose beginning to freeze, tiny ice crystals forming with each breath. Then your ears begin to ache. They're exposed, sticking out from under the fur hood you're wearing even as you sleep. Ears are vulnerable. Ears are often the first thing to get frostbitten because blood vessels there are so close to the surface, so easily cooled by moving air. The ache in your ears is a warning system, your body's way of saying something is wrong. Pay attention, protect yourself. Your fingers tucked deep inside the rabbit skin mittens your grandmother made, mittens lined with cattail down and the soft underfur of beaver. start to tingle with the warning that warmth is retreating. Your body is making decisions about blood flow now, prioritizing your core, pulling warmth away from your extremities to protect your heart, your lungs, your vital organs. This is how hypothermia begins. With this slow retreat of warmth from the outside in, like an army falling back to defend the castle keep while abandoning the outer walls to the enemy. The fire in the center of the teepee is still burning. Always burning. That's the rule. The first rule. The most important rule. The rule that supersedes all other rules. Because a fire that goes out in January on the Great Plains isn't just inconvenient. It's not just uncomfortable. It's a death sentence written in ice, and the sentence is carried out quickly. You have maybe 2 hours after a fire goes out before the inside of the teepee drops to the same temperature as outside. And outside right now is somewhere around -30 degrees Fahrenheit, not counting the wind chill. Someone has to be responsible for the fire at all times. It's a rotation, worked out carefully at the beginning of winter. The young adults take the middle of the night shifts because they can wake easily and function on interrupted sleep. The elders take the early morning shifts because they wake early anyway, their bodies no longer producing the deep sleep of youth. The children are excused from fire duty because a mistake would be catastrophic. And children, being children, sometimes make mistakes. Tonight, it's your father's turn. You can see him if you open your eyes just slightly, sitting cross-legged by the fire, feeding it carefully chosen pieces of cottonwood. Not too much, never too much at once. Fuel conservation is critical in winter. Every piece of wood, every dried buffalo chip, every bundle of grass that can be burned has to last from the first freeze in November until the final thaw in March or April. What you have at the start of winter is what you have. There's no getting more. The snow is too deep to gather dead wood. The buffalo are far to the south. The grass is buried under feet of snow and ice. Your father feeds the fire with the attention of a man performing a sacred ritual, which, in a way, he is. This fire is life. This fire is the center of everything. Around this fire, the family gathers. Around this fire, stories are told. Around this fire, food is cooked and tools are made, and children are taught the ways of the world. But more than any of that, this fire is the barrier between survival and death. It's the thin orange line between being human and being frozen meat. Outside, the wind has found its voice. It's not howling. Not yet. That will come later, when the real storm arrives, when the system that's been building over the northern territories finally sweeps down across the open plains with nothing to slow it, nothing to break its fury. Right now, the wind is still in what you might call the reconnaissance phase, testing, probing, searching for weakness. It makes a sound like breathing. Long, slow inhales as it gathers itself across miles of frozen grassland. Then the exhale, pushing against the teepee's conical shape, making the whole structure sway just slightly, just enough to remind you that this shelter is not a house. It's not stone or brick or permanent. It's an agreement with the wind. a negotiation, a respectful request. Please, the teeper seems to say, let us survive the night. And sometimes, if the tapa is well made, if the stakes are driven deep, if the stones around the bottom edge are heavy enough, the wind agrees. But the wind gives nothing for free. It extracts payment in the form of cold, always probing, always testing, always finding those tiny gaps where hide meets hide, where pole meets ground, where the smoke flaps at the top need to stay open enough to let smoke out, but closed enough to keep warmth in. It's a delicate balance, and the wind knows it. Your body is telling you something. Has been for a while now, actually, for maybe an hour or more, though you've been trying to ignore it, trying to will it away. That pressure, that growing insistence that won't be ignored no matter how tightly you curl up into a ball, no matter how deeply you burrow into the warmth of the furs, no matter how firmly you clench your muscles. Nature is calling, and nature doesn't care that it's the middle of January, doesn't care that the last time anyone checked, just before sunset, when there was still enough light to see clearly, the snow had drifted 4 feet high around the Taipei's eastern side, pushed there by winds that had been blowing steadily from the west for 3 days straight. Doesn't care that the nearest designated area for relieving yourself is a 50-step walk through knee-deep snow, past the other 6 teepees where families are sleeping, past the small enclosure where the horses huddle together for warmth, out to that spot downwind, that carefully chosen spot where the community has agreed, where the elders have always said, this is the place. This is where we go. This is where we maintain our health and respect the earth. 50 steps. In daylight, in good weather, in autumn or late spring when the ground is dry and the air is merely cool rather than lethal, it's nothing. A minute, maybe 2, a brief walk. An inconvenience so minor you wouldn't even think about it. Tonight, those 50 steps are an expedition into a landscape that has forgotten what mercy means. Tonight, those 50 steps might as well be 50 miles, for all the danger they represent. You lie there, doing the calculation that every human being has done since we first started thinking about consequences, since we first developed the capacity to weigh present discomfort against future risk. Can I wait? Can I hold it until morning? The sun will rise in, what, 5 hours? 6? That's not so long. That's manageable. Surely a person can manage that. Surely your body can cooperate for just a few more hours. But your bladder isn't asking anymore. It stopped asking 20 minutes ago. Now it's demanding. Now it's insisting with a pressure that's becoming painful, that's making it impossible to think about anything else, that's disrupting sleep and making your entire body tense with the effort of resistance. And so, you make the decision that your ancestors have made for thousands of years, the decision that your children will make for generations to come if the world doesn't change too much. You're going out there, into the cold, into the darkness, into the wind. You're going because there's no choice, because holding it isn't an option anymore, because your body has its needs, and those needs don't negotiate. The first movement is always the hardest. Leaving the warmth of the furs feels like peeling off your own skin, like shedding a layer of protection you desperately need. The cold air that's been kept at bay by your body heat, and the layers of rabbit and deer and buffalo, air that's been trapped and warmed and made breathable, immediately rushes in to fill the warm space you're abandoning. You can actually hear the furs settling, a soft whisper of hide against hide, as if they're disappointed you're leaving, as if they know that some of the warmth stored in them is escaping right now, dissipating into the cooler air of the teepee, lost forever. Your winter moccasins are right where you left them when you went to sleep, positioned perfectly so you can slip your feet in without having to fully stand in the frigid air that pools at ground level. This is one of those tricks that experience teaches. Cold air sinks, always. It's heavier than warm air, and it flows like water to the lowest point. The coldest air in the teepee is always at the bottom, maybe 6 inches up from the earth. So you move with purpose, quickly, but not so quickly that you disturb your sleeping family members, your mother and younger brother and baby sister, all of whom have their own warm nests of furs. You move efficiently, the way someone moves when they've done this 100 times before, when the routine is so ingrained that your body knows the steps, even though your mind is still fuzzy with sleep. The moccasins are cold. Of course they're cold. There's no heat down here at ground level, and leather holds cold the way it holds heat, slowly and thoroughly. Your feet recoil from the shock of it, but you push through, forcing your feet into the stiff leather, feeling the fleece lining, rabbit fur again. Always rabbit fur for lining because it's so soft, gradually warming from your body heat. It will take minutes before the moccasins become comfortable. You don't have minutes. You have urgency. Your winter coat is hanging from one of the lodge poles, the tall poles that form the skeleton of the teepee, that meet at the top and create the distinctive conical shape. It's a masterpiece of survival engineering, though no one in your tribe calls it that. They just call it a coat, a winter coat. But it represents hundreds of hours of work and a deep understanding of how to trap warmth and repel cold. The outer layer is made from elk hide, the toughest, most durable leather available. Elk are large animals, and their hides, when properly tanned, are both strong and somewhat water-resistant. This is important because snow melting on your coat and then freezing again can create a shell of ice that actually conducts cold rather than insulating against it. So the elk hide is treated, worked with a mixture of animal brains and wood smoke, a process that takes weeks and leaves the hide with a slightly waxy surface that sheds moisture. Inside the elk hide shell is a layer of rabbit fur, sewn in carefully so that the fur faces inward toward your body. Rabbit fur is magic. It's light, incredibly light, but it traps air like nothing else. And trapped air is what keeps you warm. Not the fur itself, but the thousands of tiny pockets of air between the individual hairs. Your body warms that air, and the fur holds it close, creating a microclimate of warmth wrapped around you. The coat has a hood, deep and lined with wolf fur around the face opening. Wolf fur doesn't frost up when you breathe on it, some property of the structure of the individual hairs that no one fully understands, but everyone knows from experience. When your breath, warm, moist, hits cold air, it creates frost. Frost on fur around your face means ice crystals getting in your eyes, your nose, your mouth. Wolf fur resists this, so wolf fur goes around the hood, even though wolf is difficult to hunt, even though each hood requires fur from several wolves. It's worth it. Your face needs to be protected. You wrap the coat around yourself, and immediately you feel the temperature differential. Not warm, not yet. The coat is still cold from hanging all night, but warmer, a little warmer. In January, on the plains, where temperature differentials of 60 or 70 degrees exist between inside the teepee and outside in the wind, a little warmer is the difference between life and death. A few degrees can be the difference between functional fingers and frostbitten fingers, between clear thinking and the confusion that comes with hypothermia. The flap of the teepee is tied shut, of course. Everything is tied shut in winter. Every opening, every potential gap where heat could escape or cold could enter is secured. The flap itself is a double layer of buffalo hide, hung so that one piece overlaps the other, creating a kind of airlock. This design prevents wind from blowing directly into the teepee. When you open the outer flap, the inner flap is still there. When you step outside and close the outer flap behind you, the cold that followed you out is trapped in the space between the two flaps, rather than penetrating all the way inside. You work the frozen leather ties with fingers that are already starting to lose their dexterity, already stiffening in the cold air near the entrance. This is another lesson the cold teaches. Everything takes longer when your fingers don't quite work properly. The knot your father tied is tight, made tight deliberately so that wind can't loosen it. You fumble with it, precious seconds ticking by, awareness of your bladder growing more urgent. Finally, the tie loosens. The knot gives. You can open the flap. You take a breath, one last breath of relatively warm air, and then you lift the flap and step through. And the night comes in. The cold hits you like a slap. No, not a slap. A slap would be over quickly. This is more like submersion, like being plunged into water that's so cold it stops being water and becomes something else entirely. Something with teeth, something with intention. Your first breath in the outside air burns, actually burns, as if you've inhaled smoke instead of oxygen. The moisture in your lungs meets air that's 50, 60, maybe 70 degrees colder than your body temperature, and the collision creates a sensation that's part pain, part shock, part something you don't have words for because you've never felt anything quite like it before. Even though you've done this dozens of times this winter alone, you can hear your breath, not just feel it, but hear it. Each exhale creates a small cloud of vapor that crystallizes instantly, making a sound like the faintest whisper of sand falling on ice. And each inhale brings with it the smell of winter, not the lack of smell, the way people sometimes describe cold, but a specific scent, clean and sharp and metallic, like licking a knife blade. It's the smell of air so cold that nothing organic can survive in it long enough to decay, to produce odor. The smell of purity through violence. The darkness is not complete. There's a quality to winter darkness that's different from summer night. The snow reflects what little light exists. The stars, the moon hidden behind clouds, the faint glow from neighboring teepees. Everything is rendered in shades of blue, grey and white, shadows that shift and move with the wind. You can see, but not well, not enough. Just enough to know that you're very small and the night is very large. Your body wants to go back inside. Every cell, every instinct, every primal bit of your brain is screaming, "This is wrong. This is dangerous. This is the environment that kills things like you. Turn around. Go back. Safety is 3 steps behind you. Warmth is 3 steps behind you. Life is 3 steps behind you." But you don't turn around. Because you're not just body. You're also mind. You're also will. You're also the accumulation of your grandmother's teaching and your father's example and every story you've ever heard about people who survived because they did the hard thing and people who died because they didn't. And because your bladder is insistent in a way that transcends fear. You take your first step away from the teepee, then your second. The snow crunches under your moccasins, a sound that carries in the still air between gusts of wind. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step is a small commitment. Each step takes you further from safety and closer to the designated area. Each step is reversible, theoretically, but each step also makes turning back feel more shameful, more like failure, more like the kind of weakness that gets talked about around fires for winters to come. 10 steps now. The wind finds you again, having momentarily lost you in the lee of the teepee. It pushes against you from the west, the northwest, the direction it always comes from, the direction you can count on like you can count on sunrise. The wind makes sounds. Not just one sound, but a whole vocabulary of sounds depending on what it's hitting, what it's moving through. Against your coat, it makes a flapping, drumming sound, like leather slapping leather. Through the space between teepees, it howls, actually howls. A sound that's almost vocal, almost like something alive and hungry. Across the open snow beyond the camp, it whispers, sibilant and sinister, like a snake made of air and ice. And underneath all of that, if you listen carefully, if you tune out your own breathing and footsteps and the blood rushing in your ears, you can hear the fire inside the teepee you just left. The crack and pop of wood burning, the slight whoosh of rising smoke. It's barely audible, but it's there. A reminder of what you're coming back to. A promise that this won't last forever. Before we go further out into that January darkness, before we follow you on those 50 steps through cold that doesn't forgive mistakes, I need to tell you about something. About someone, actually. About the person who makes all of this possible, who holds the whole system together through nothing more than knowledge and consistency, and the kind of authority that comes from being right over and over again for 7 decades. Her name has been lost to time, which is how it goes with most of the people who held communities together through the dark months. most of the people who did the essential, unglamorous work of keeping everyone alive. History remembers warriors. History remembers chiefs. History remembers the dramatic moments, the battles, the grand gestures. History forgets the daily maintenance of survival. But let's call her what the children in her tribe called her. What 3 generations of children have called her. Grandmother watching. Not because she was always stern, though she could certainly be stern when someone was being careless with fire or wasting precious resources or putting the community at risk through thoughtlessness, but because she watched everything, all the time, with an intensity of attention that most people never achieve, an awareness that seemed to encompass the entire camp simultaneously. She watched the way the smoke moved up through the teepee's opening in the morning, reading the air currents, predicting how the wind would behave that day. She watched the color of the snow, knowing that wet snow means warming temperatures, that dry powder means extreme cold, that yellow-tinged snow near the camp means someone isn't walking far enough to the designated area. She watched the behavior of the horses, how they stood, where they positioned themselves relative to the wind, their restlessness predicting incoming storms, sometimes a full day, before any human could see the signs. She watched the cough of a child, distinguishing between the dry cough of cold air irritation and the wet cough of lung infection, knowing which one needed medicine and which one just needed warm tea and patience. She watched the smell of the wind, knowing that certain odors meant certain weather changes. She watched everything, and she remembered what she saw. She was 72 winters old. 72. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. In the year we're visiting, 1780 or thereabouts, in a world without antibiotics or surgery or even a basic understanding of germ theory, living to 72 was extraordinary. It meant you'd survived everything. Childhood diseases that killed half of all children before age 5. Injuries that could easily become infected and fatal. Childbirth, which was dangerous for both mother and infant. Harsh winters that claimed the old, the young, the weak. Periods of hunger when buffalo was scarce. Conflicts with rival tribes or with animals. 72 winters meant you were a library. A living record of every winter storm. Every survival technique that worked, and every one that failed. Every mistake that had cost someone their life. Every innovation that had saved one. You were weather patterns and animal behavior, and plant knowledge and social dynamics, and spiritual wisdom, all wrapped up in one increasingly frail body. And grandmother watching knew more about winter sanitation than anyone alive, more than the medicine woman who specialized in healing, more than the chief who focused on larger strategic decisions, more than anyone. You might laugh at that. Winter sanitation. It sounds so formal, so bureaucratic, so mundane, like a job description from a modern city government. The Department of Winter Sanitation. It sounds almost comical, but grandmother watching would tell you. If you sat with her by the fire and earned her trust, if you listened respectfully and didn't interrupt and showed that you were genuinely trying to learn rather than just going through the motions, she would tell you that knowing how to properly relieve yourself in winter weather wasn't a small thing. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't trivial or embarrassing or beneath serious consideration. It was one of the pillars that kept everyone alive. One of the fundamental practices that made the difference between a tribe that survived the winter, healthy and intact, and a tribe that didn't. She'd seen people die from getting this wrong. Not many, because the tribe learned quickly and taught thoroughly. But enough. Enough to know that the protocols mattered, that the details mattered, that the discipline mattered. She'd seen a young man die, 19 winters old, strong, healthy, arrogant. In the way that young men who've never really been tested by the world can be arrogant. He refused to walk all the way to the designated area during a storm, claimed it was too far, too cold, too dangerous, said he'd just go 10 feet from the teepee. What difference could it make? It would freeze anyway. The cold would kill any smell. He'd be fine. Everyone would be fine. And for a while, he was right. For a few weeks, nothing bad happened. The waste froze. The smell was minimal. He congratulated himself for being practical, for not following their old ways so rigidly, for thinking for himself. But he was upwind. He'd positioned himself upwind of the camp, and the smell, faint but definitely there, carried on the wind, carried for miles across the frozen plains, carried directly to the nose of a wolf pack that had been trailing the camp for weeks, hoping for an opportunity, for a moment of weakness, for a mistake. Wolves in winter are not the noble creatures of summer. In summer, when prey is abundant, wolves are selective, cautious, strategic. In winter, when every animal is on the edge of starvation, wolves are desperate, dangerous, willing to take risks they'd never take in other seasons. And they investigate every smell that might lead to food, every possible opportunity for a kill. The wolves didn't attack the camp directly. They weren't that desperate yet, but they came close, closer than they should have. And in the confusion of trying to drive them away, in the chaos of barking dogs and shouting men and horses panicking, 3 horses broke free from their enclosure. Horses that were needed for hunting, for carrying supplies, for survival. 2 were recovered. 1 disappeared into the night and was never seen again. And the young man's younger brother, 14 winters old, was kicked by one of the panicking horses. Kicked hard, in the leg, fracturing the bone. In summer, that injury might have healed. In winter, with limited mobility, with the cold making healing slower, with no way to really rest the leg properly, the fracture never set correctly. The boy walked with a limp for the rest of his life, walked poorly, couldn't hunt effectively, became more burden than asset to the tribe, though no one said that out loud, because that's not how the tribe worked. But everyone knew. Everyone understood the connection between one man's carelessness and one boy's permanent injury. The young man never broke protocol again. He walked the full 50 steps every single time after that, even in the worst weather. But the damage was done. The lesson was learned the hard way. Grandmother watching had seen families get sick, entire tepes filled with fever and dysentery, people too weak to stand, children crying with stomach cramps, elders becoming dehydrated and disoriented. And she'd traced it back every time to contamination, to someone who didn't walk far enough from the snow they were using for water, to someone who assumed the cold would kill everything, to someone who thought they knew better than the protocols. The cold doesn't kill everything. That's the fundamental mistake. The cold slows things down. It freezes them in place. It puts biological processes into a kind of suspended animation. But it doesn't sterilize. It doesn't eliminate. It just pauses. And come spring, when the thaw arrives, when that frozen waste begins to melt and seep into the ground, then you have a biological time bomb. Then you have the perfect conditions for the diseases that kill families, that wipe out entire camps, that leave teepees empty and stories unfinished. So grandmother watching taught, constantly, patiently, relentlessly, to the children when they were first learning, when they were 5 or 6 years old, and just beginning to understand that there were rules about where you could and couldn't go. To the young parents who were navigating their first winter with infants. To anyone new who joined the tribe through marriage or adoption. And most importantly, she taught by example. Every single morning, regardless of weather, regardless of how she felt, regardless of wind or snow or cold, so intense it made breathing painful, she made the walk. 50 steps downwind, 50 steps through whatever the night had delivered. Fresh snow, ice, wind, darkness. She made the walk with dignity, with purpose, with the kind of steady determination that said, this matters. This is not optional. This is how we stay alive. And when she returned, she always said the same thing. Always. Every morning for longer than anyone could remember, she'd come back through the entrance flap, brush the snow from her coat, warm her hands by the fire, and say, the earth accepts what we give with respect. It was practically a prayer, a mantra, a reminder. The earth accepts what we give with respect. Not the earth is our garbage disposal. Not do whatever is convenient. Not the cold will take care of everything. But respect. Respect for the earth, yes, but also respect for the system, respect for the protocols, respect for the accumulated wisdom of generations. And on nights like tonight, when the cold is testing everyone's resolve, when every single person in every single teepee is having the same internal debate. Can I wait? Should I risk it? Maybe I could just go closer, just this once, just tonight because it's so cold. Grandmother Watching's teaching is what keeps people safe. Her voice in their heads, her example in their memories, her 72 winters of consistency saying, the walk must be made, the designated area must be used, the protocols must be followed, not because of rules for rules' sake, not because of punishment, not because someone will be watching and judging, but because in the January darkness of the Great Plains, there is no room for shortcuts. Shortcuts kill, carelessness kills. Thinking you can make your own rules, thinking you know better than the collective experience of thousands of years, kills. The cold is the ultimate enforcer of discipline. The cold doesn't care about excuses. The cold doesn't forgive. The cold simply responds to your actions with consequences that are immediate and absolute. And Grandmother Watching was its prophet, its voice, its human interpreter. She couldn't control the weather. She couldn't make the winter shorter or less harsh. But she could make sure that everyone understood how to live within winter's rules. She could make sure that the knowledge survived, that the protocols were maintained, that no one died from ignorance when wisdom was available. This is leadership. Not the flashy kind that we celebrate in history books. Not the dramatic, masculine, warrior leadership of battle and conquest. But the quiet, patient, absolutely essential leadership of daily survival. The leadership of teaching the same lesson 1,000 times to different people at different stages of readiness. The leadership of consistency, of modeling behavior, of being the person who never cuts corners, even when cutting corners would be so much easier. If you'd asked grandmother watching what she did, what her role was, what made her important to the tribe, she probably would have shrugged. "I'm old," she might say. "I watch things. I remember things. I tell people what I remember." She wouldn't have claimed any special authority, wouldn't have thought of herself as essential. But everyone else knew. Everyone else understood. When grandmother watching died, whenever that eventually happened, there would be a hole in the tribe. Knowledge would be lost. Wisdom would be diluted. The tribe would have to work harder to maintain the same level of safety and health that her presence made seem effortless. Because that's what expertise does. It makes the difficult look easy. It makes the complex seem simple. It makes survival look inevitable, rather than the result of constant, careful, disciplined effort. Let me show you what that teaching looked like. Let me take you to a specific morning, maybe 3 winters ago, when grandmother watching was working with a young girl named Walks Quietly. 7 years old, bright-eyed, curious in the way that children are curious before the world teaches them to stop asking questions. They're sitting by the fire, just the 2 of them, before the rest of the camp has fully awakened. The girl has just made her first solo walk to the sanitation area in the dark. She's proud of herself. She wants grandmother to acknowledge her accomplishment. "I did it," Walks quietly says. "I walked all the way. I used the ash. I came back." Grandmother watching nods, slowly, deliberately. She's warming her hands over the fire, fingers that are gnarled with age, knuckles swollen from decades of work and cold. "You did," she says, "and you're here. That's good." A pause. The fire crackles. Outside, someone is coughing in another teepee. The wet cough that means lung sickness might be starting. That means the medicine woman will need to be involved. "But tell me," grandmother continues, her eyes still on the fire, not looking at the child. "When you left the teepee, what direction did you turn?" "Southeast," the girl answers quickly. "The way we always go." "And how did you know it was southeast?" The markers. I followed the markers." "The markers only tell you that you're on a path," grandmother says. "They don't tell you which path. What if someone moved them? What if the snow covered them? What if a storm came and you needed to find the area without markers?" The girl doesn't have an answer. Her pride deflates slightly. She thought she'd done everything right. Grandmother watching finally looks at her. Her eyes are dark, deep set, surrounded by wrinkles that map every smile, every squint against sun and snow, every moment of concentration over 7 decades. And in those eyes is something that could be mistaken for sternness, but is actually fierce love. The kind of love that refuses to let you be less than you're capable of being. When you left the teepee, she says, voice gentle now, was the wind on your face or on your back? My face, the girl says slowly, thinking about it. Always, grandmother says. The wind here in winter comes from the northwest. Always. If you walk into the wind, you're going northwest. If the wind is on your left side, you're going northeast. If it's on your right, you're going southwest. And if it's on your back, southeast, the girl finishes. Toward the area. Yes, the markers are good. But the wind is better. The wind doesn't lie. The wind can't be moved or covered or confused. The wind is always telling you where you are if you listen. She reaches out, touches the girl's face briefly, a gesture that's almost tender. You did well today, she says. You were brave. But bravery without knowledge is just luck, and luck runs out. I want you to have more than luck. I want you to have wisdom. The girl nods, understanding now that this isn't criticism. This is teaching. This is the difference between doing something once correctly and understanding it deeply enough to do it correctly every time, in every condition, for the rest of your life. Next time, grandmother says, close your eyes before you leave the teepee. Stand in the entrance. Feel where the wind is coming from. Turn until it's on your back. Then open your eyes and look for the markers. That's how you'll always know you're going the right way. What if there's no wind? The girl asks. Grandmother watching smiles, a rare sight, teeth that are worn but still mostly intact. There's always wind here, she says. Always. That's why we can survive. The wind clears the path. The wind tells us direction. The wind is hard, yes, but it's also honest. And honest things, even hard things, are easier to trust than soft things that lie. This conversation, or variations of it, happened hundreds of times over Grandmother Watching's life. Different children, different questions, but always the same patience. Always the same commitment to teaching, not just the action, but the understanding behind the action. Always the same love that looked like strictness to outsiders, but was recognized by those who received it as the greatest gift, the gift of competence, the gift of confidence that comes from true knowledge rather than lucky success, and walks quietly, for her part, never forgot. She grew up, she had children of her own, and when they were old enough to learn, she taught them the same lesson. Feel the wind, know the direction, trust the honest things, even when they're hard. This is how culture survives, not through grand declarations or written documents, but through morning conversations by the fire between old women and young girls, between those who remember and those who need to learn, between one generation and the next, passing forward the accumulated wisdom of survival, one careful word at a time. Now, you need to understand something about the place we're talking about the landscape itself, because the land isn't neutral here. It's not just a stage where human drama unfolds. The land is an active participant, a force with its own character and preferences and ways of responding to human choices. The Great Plains in winter aren't just cold, they're architecturally cold. The landscape itself becomes a weapon, or if you prefer a less violent metaphor, a test. An examination with no partial credit, where passing means you survive and failing means you don't. Imagine an ocean, but instead of water, it's grass. Or rather, it was grass before the snow came, before winter erased color and texture and left only white. Now, it's just white in every direction. White rolling in frozen waves as far as you can see during daylight, which isn't very far because the air itself becomes opaque in extreme cold, filled with tiny ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere, creating a kind of permanent haze that limits visibility even on clear days. The horizon, that line where earth meets sky, becomes uncertain. On particularly cold days, when the ice crystals in the air reach a certain density, the horizon disappears entirely. Sky and ground merge into a single blank wall of white-grey nothingness. This is called a whiteout, and it's one of the most dangerous weather phenomena on the plains. People have died 10 feet from their teepee in whiteout conditions, died because they couldn't see the entrance, couldn't find their way back, couldn't tell which direction was which. They walked in circles. They wandered off into empty prairie. They froze within shouting distance of safety, and no one heard them because the wind was too loud. No trees to speak of on the open plains. Maybe a few cottonwoods huddled near a creek that's now frozen solid, their bare branches rattling like bones in the wind, but mostly just open, exposed, vulnerable. The technical term is treeless grassland. But that hardly captures the psychological impact of being in a place where there's nothing between you and the horizon except distance. When the wind comes, and the wind always comes, it has nothing to stop it. No forests to break its speed, no mountains to redirect it, no barriers of any kind. It builds speed over hundreds of miles, gathering momentum the way a boulder gains speed, rolling down a mountain, gathering malice as if the wind itself resents anything alive, anything warm, anything that dares to exist in this frozen wasteland. By the time the wind reaches your camp, it's moving at 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles per hour, sometimes faster during real storms, and it's carrying ice crystals, not snow, not soft, fluffy flakes, ice. Little tiny knives that cut any exposed skin within seconds. Your face, if you're foolish enough to expose it, will be covered in tiny scratches, tiny wounds, all bleeding slightly, all freezing immediately, creating a mask of blood ice that's painful to remove. The temperature without wind might be 10 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit. Cold, certainly, uncomfortable without proper clothing, but manageable, survivable. You could work in that temperature if you dressed appropriately. You could walk from here to there without serious risk. But add that wind, and suddenly the effective temperature, the feels-like temperature that your body experiences, drops to 30 below, 40 below, 50 below in the worst cases. The kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe, like you're inhaling glass shards. The kind of cold that turns your eyelashes white with frost after a single blink. The kind of cold that makes moisture freeze inside your nostrils, creating ice that scratches the delicate skin with every breath. This is the world you're walking into when you leave the teepee tonight. This is the environment that has no interest in whether you live or die, that will kill you just as efficiently whether you're good or bad, young or old, loved or alone. The cold is perfectly democratic. It treats everyone exactly the same, as a problem to be solved, as warmth to be extracted, as energy to be dissipated. And this is why the location of the sanitation area matters so much. Why it's not arbitrary. Why it's not anywhere will do as long as it's far enough away. The location is chosen with the same care that a military general might use in choosing a battlefield position. Because, in a way, that's what it is. A battlefield where the enemy is exposure, disease, contamination, and death. The site was chosen weeks ago, back in early December, when the tribe first set up winter camp. When there was still enough daylight and enough energy and enough time to do things carefully and correctly. The elders, led by Grandmother Watching, walked the entire area surrounding the proposed camp location. They walked it systematically, thoroughly, covering every square foot of ground within 100 yards of where the teepees would stand. They walked it studying the terrain with the same intensity that you might study a map before a long journey. And they were looking at wind patterns first. Always wind patterns first. On the plains, the prevailing wind comes from the northwest, consistent as sunrise, reliable as death. Day after day, month after month, the wind blows from northwest to southeast. There are variations, of course, local weather systems that create temporary changes. But the dominant pattern, the pattern you can count on, is northwest to southeast. So the sanitation area had to be southeast of the main camp. Downwind, always downwind, always in the direction that wind naturally carries smells, particles, contamination. This wasn't just about comfort, though comfort mattered. It wasn't just about avoiding unpleasant odors near the living area, though that was certainly a consideration. It was about snowdrift patterns. Wind creates drifts. Everyone knows this. But understanding how and why and where drifts form, that's specialized knowledge. Drifts form on the downwind side of obstacles. If there's a rock, snow piles up behind it. If there's a bush, snow accumulates on the sheltered side. If there's a teepee, snow drifts against the side that's away from the wind. Now, if you put the sanitation area upwind of camp, the drifts would form between the teepees and the area. The path would gradually become impassable as winter went on. As storm after storm added more snow to the drift, as the accumulated snow hardened into something almost like ice, too solid to walk through, too extensive to walk around. Eventually, you'd have walls of snow 10 feet high blocking the way, and then people would start taking shortcuts. They'd stop using the designated area because getting to it became too difficult. And shortcuts, as we've established, as Grandmother Watching never stops reminding everyone, kill. But put the sanitation area downwind, and the drifts form away from the camp, away from the path. The wind actually helps keep the path clear, scouring it, preventing major accumulation. It's not perfect. You still have to maintain the path, still have to pack it down after storms, still have to mark it clearly. But it's manageable. it's sustainable throughout a long winter. They looked at the slope next. Even though everything was frozen now in early December, even though the ground was hard as granite and covered in snow, the elders were thinking about April, about May, about the thaw, about what would happen when all this frozen waste began to melt, when the snow turned to water, when the ice released its grip on the earth. Water runs downhill, always. It follows gravity with absolute certainty, and water carries things with it. Nutrients, yes, but also contamination, bacteria, disease, everything that accumulated all winter long, frozen and dormant, suddenly becomes mobile again when the thaw arrives. Suddenly, it's in the water, in the mud, seeping through the soil, flowing toward the lowest point. So the sanitation area needed to be on lower ground than the camp, but also lower than the creek where they harvested ice for water. The site they chose was a subtle depression, maybe 30 or 40 yards below the main camp elevation. Not a dramatic drop. The plains aren't particularly hilly, but enough of a slope that gravity would work in their favor when spring came. Enough of a drop that contaminated meltwater would flow away from the camp and away from the water source rather than toward it. They looked at the snow patterns too, the way snow naturally accumulated in this particular location. Some areas on the plains naturally collect more snow because of the way wind interacts with terrain. Other areas collect less. The ideal sanitation area was one of these lighter accumulation zones, not completely bare. Nothing was bare in January, not in a normal winter, but shallow enough that you could walk without sinking past your knees, without exhausting yourself just getting there and back. And they looked at the distances. How far was far enough? How far was too far? This was a calculation, an equation with multiple variables. Too close, and you risked smell, contamination, animals being drawn to the camp. Too far, and you risked people taking shortcuts, risked someone getting lost in a storm, risked exposure injuries from spending too long outside in extreme cold. They settled on 50 steps. 50 steps from the nearest teepee to the sanitation area. 50 steps was far enough that smell wouldn't travel back to camp on even the stillest days. Those rare winter days when the wind died completely and the cold became even more intense, because moving air, for all its dangers, does provide some protection against the deepest cold. 50 steps was far enough that any predators drawn to the site would have to cross open ground where they could be seen, where the dogs would alert, where men could grab weapons and respond before danger reached the camp. But 50 steps wasn't so far that someone caught in a sudden whiteout couldn't find their way back by counting. 50 steps wasn't so far that a child, if supervised, couldn't make the journey safely. 50 steps wasn't so far that an elder, moving slowly, would risk frostbite just from the time spent walking. 50 steps. Always 50 steps. This became the standard, the protocol, the agreed-upon distance that balanced all the competing needs and risks. The community marked the path with willow branches. Willow grows near water, near the creek that's now frozen, and it's flexible even when dry, unlikely to snap in wind or under snow load. The branches were stripped of leaves and smaller twigs, leaving just the main stem, then pushed into the ground at regular intervals. maybe every 10 steps. 5 markers total from camp to sanitation area. In daylight, you could see them easily, dark lines against white snow. At night, you could feel them with your hand as you passed, a tactile confirmation that you were still on the path, still heading the right direction, still safe. And if a storm came up, if visibility dropped to 0, if you couldn't see your own feet in the blowing snow, you could grab one marker and then reach out for the next, following them like a rope, like a lifeline back to safety. But here's what really makes this system brilliant, what separates it from just a pragmatic solution and turns it into genuine wisdom that's been refined over centuries. They had 3 sites, 3 different locations, each 50 steps from camp, but in different directions. Southeast for the main prevailing wind, east-southeast for when the wind shifted slightly, and directly east for those rare days when weather systems brought wind from unusual directions. They rotated use every 2 weeks. Site 1 for the first 2 weeks of winter, Site 2 for the next 2 weeks, Site 3 for the following 2 weeks. Then back to Site 1, which had now been unused for 4 weeks. Why this rotation? Why not just use one site all winter long? Keep it simple. Reduce the mental load of remembering which site was current. Because frozen waste isn't really frozen. Not completely. Not in the way that a rock is solid. Even at 20 below 0, biological activity doesn't stop entirely. It slows. Yes, it becomes sluggish. The bacteria that break down organic matter work at a fraction of their normal speed. But they work. Slowly, gradually, they're still processing, still decomposing, still converting waste back into simpler compounds. And more importantly, there's accumulation. Even with ash treatment, even with snow cover, even with everything done correctly, waste accumulates. A little bit per person per day. Multiply that by 50 people using the same site for 2 weeks. That's 700 person uses. That's a lot of waste in one location, even spread over 50 square yards. By rotating sites, they gave each location a month to process what had been left there before it was used again. A month for bacteria, slow as they were in the cold, to work. A month for freezing and thawing cycles, which happened even in January when daytime sun sometimes warmed surfaces above freezing, even though night temperatures plunged. To break down structure. A month for nature to do what nature does, which is recycle, reintegrate, transform waste back into earth. This is what I meant earlier when I said this was wisdom, not just survival. This wasn't reactive problem solving. This wasn't, oh, that site is getting full. I guess we need a new one. This was proactive, systemic, thoughtful management of resources and space and impact. This was understanding that every action has a consequence and that you can't cheat the earth. You can only work with it or eventually suffer the results of working against it. Compare this to what the white settlers would do when they arrived on the plains 100 years later. They'd build permanent outhouses, fixed locations, right next to houses. Sometimes, and this is almost unbelievable when you think about it, right over the same creek they drew drinking water from. The result? Disease. Constant, grinding, killing disease. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Diseases that spread through fecal contamination of water supplies. diseases that killed thousands, diseases that should have been completely preventable. The Native Americans had figured out thousands of years ago what European cities wouldn't understand until the late 1800s, wouldn't act on until governments were forced to build modern sewage systems. Waste management is public health. Location is everything. Distance is essential. And the earth is your partner in this, not your toilet. Treat it with respect, work with its natural processes, and it will take care of you. Treat it carelessly, and it will kill you just as surely as the cold or the wolves or any other danger. So when you step out of that teepee tonight, when you're walking those 50 steps through the frozen darkness, you're not just making a trip to the bathroom. You're participating in a system that has kept people alive for generations. You're honoring a wisdom that was hard-earned, paid for in the currency of frozen bodies and bitter lessons, and careful observation and multi-generational refinement. 50 steps southeast, through the white darkness, following the willow markers, to the place where the earth accepts what we give with respect. And when spring comes, when the snow melts, when the earth reveals itself again, there will be almost no trace that anyone was ever there. The system will have worked. The earth will have processed. The water will be clean. The tribe will be healthy. And they'll return next winter and do it all again, because this is what survival looks like. Not heroic gestures, not dramatic last stands, but careful attention to detail, respect for proven methods, and the wisdom to know that you are never, ever smarter than 10,000 years of collective human experience encoded in protocols that work. But let me tell you what happens when you don't follow those protocols. Let me tell you about the ticking clock that exists outside in that darkness, counting down with every second of exposure, every moment of hesitation, every small mistake. You're at 35 steps now, somewhere between halfway and the destination. This is the danger zone. This is where people make critical errors, because your body is starting to register the cold in ways that go beyond discomfort and move into the territory of damage. Your fingers inside your gloves, they're not just cold anymore. They're approaching that threshold where cold becomes something else, where sensation starts to disappear, not because you're numb, but because the nerves themselves are beginning to shut down. You have perhaps 3 minutes, maybe 4, before the cold progresses from painful to dangerous to irrevocable. 3 minutes, 180 seconds. Time yourself right now in your warm room. Close your eyes and count to 180. Notice how long that feels. Now imagine spending that entire time exposed to temperatures that are actively trying to kill you, while trying to complete a task that requires manual dexterity and privacy and dignity. Your face, the exposed skin around your eyes, your nose, your lips. Ice crystals are forming, not just on your eyelashes, which you can see and blink away, but in the moisture on your skin itself. Tiny crystals, almost invisible, that are the first stage of frostbite. Stage 1 is reversible. Stage 1 heals. But stage 1 transitions to stage 2 very quickly, and stage 2 means tissue damage. Stage 2 means scars. Stage 2 means you'll know for the rest of your life that you spent too long outside one January night. And here's what your body is doing right now without your conscious input. It's making triage decisions. It's pulling blood away from your extremities to protect your core. Your fingers and toes are being sacrificed to save your heart and lungs and brain. This is a survival mechanism that's millions of years old, older than humanity itself, older than mammals, maybe. When the environment becomes hostile enough, the body protects what's essential and abandons what's expendable. But your fingers aren't expendable. You need them. You need them for everything. For holding tools, for making clothes, for feeding yourself, for all the tasks that keep you alive in this world where survival requires constant manual effort. If you lose your fingers to frostbite tonight, you don't just lose them tonight, you lose them forever. And in losing them, you become less capable, more dependent, more vulnerable. In a world without disability services, without social safety nets, without mechanical aids, losing your fingers might mean losing your life, just more slowly. 40 steps. Your lungs are starting to hurt now. Each breath feels like you're inhaling tiny shards of glass. This is because the cold air is so dry, so completely devoid of moisture, that it's desiccating your lung tissue. The delicate membranes that exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide are designed to work with moist air, warm air, air that's compatible with human biology. This air is none of those things. This air is hostile, and with each breath, you're doing microscopic damage to your lungs. Not enough to kill you, not tonight. But if you had to stay out here for hours, if you had to spend days in this environment without shelter, your lungs would fail. They'd dry out, crack, bleed. People drown in their own blood in extreme cold, not from freezing, but from the air itself destroying the tissues that keep them alive. 45 steps, and there's a sound behind you. Did you hear it? A crack? Or was it a crunch? Something in the darkness, back toward the camp, but not quite from the camp. Off to the side, in the empty space between teepees. You stop. You listen. The wind makes it hard to hear anything clearly. It creates false sounds, phantom noises that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. But your body, that animal part of your brain that's older and wiser than your thinking mind, is alert now. Something isn't right. Could be nothing. Probably nothing. The snow settling. A branch breaking under the weight of accumulated ice. The wind playing tricks. Or it could be something. A wolf, a coyote, some predator that's learned that winter camps sometimes produce opportunities. That learned, maybe generations ago in wolf years, that where humans live, there's food. Not the humans themselves, not usually, but scraps, bones, waste. You're standing at the sanitation area right now, the place where, for weeks, your tribe has been leaving organic material. The place that, despite the ash, despite the protocols, despite everything, still smells different from the surrounding snow. Different enough that a hungry predator might investigate, might follow the scent, might be out there right now, watching you with eyes that can see in the darkness much better than yours can. Your hand moves instinctively to your belt, where a knife should be, where a knife usually is. But you left it inside tonight. You were focused on urgency, on bladder pressure, on getting outside and getting the task done, and getting back to warmth. You didn't think about defense. You didn't prepare for the possibility that you might need to defend yourself. Another sound, closer this time. Definitely not the wind. Your heart rate increases. Adrenaline floods your system. This is useful and dangerous at the same time. Useful because it sharpens your senses, prepares you for action. Dangerous because it accelerates your metabolism, makes you burn through calories and body heat faster, shortens the time you can survive exposure. The mathematics of survival just changed. You came out here with maybe 10 minutes of safety margin. Now, with your heart pounding, with fear coursing through you, with your body preparing for fight or flight, you have maybe 7 minutes, maybe 6. You need to finish your business. You need to use the ash. You need to walk back. And you need to do all of that while remaining alert to the possibility that you're not alone out here, that something with teeth and hunger might be closing the distance between you and it while you're vulnerable, exposed, crouched in the snow. This is the ticking clock. This is the accumulated risk of every small decision, every protocol followed or skipped, every moment of preparation or lack thereof. This is why grandmother watching teaches so relentlessly, why the elders insist on following the rules even when it seems excessive, even when it feels like paranoia. Because out here, in the dark, in the cold, with predators potentially circling, paranoia is just accurate risk assessment. 50 steps, you're at the site. The clock is ticking. Every second counts now. Make it quick, make it correct, and pray that whatever made that sound isn't interested in you. You're halfway there now. 25 steps. The wind has found you. Even though you're moving as quickly as you dare, even though you're hunched down trying to minimize your profile, trying to give the wind less surface area to push against. Each gust pushes against your winter coat like a living hand trying to slow you down, trying to turn you around, trying to convince you that this is a mistake, that you should go back, that it's not worth it. The wind makes a sound around your hood, a low moan that rises and falls with each gust, a sound that's almost like speech, like the wind is trying to tell you something in a language you almost understand but can't quite translate. Your face, the only part of you that's exposed because you need to see where you're going, has gone numb. That's actually a blessing, though it doesn't feel like one. Numbness means you're not feeling the pain of the cold, which means you can focus on the task at hand. Feeling comes back later when you're inside, and it's not pleasant. But right now, numbness is a gift. The willow markers are still visible, dark lines against the white snow that covers everything. You reach for each one as you pass. A brief moment of contact, a confirmation that you're still on the path, still moving in the right direction. Getting turned around out here, losing the path in the dark, would be fatal. Not immediately, maybe. But when you couldn't find your way back, when you started walking in what you thought was the right direction, but wasn't, when your body heat started to drain away faster than you could generate it through movement, when the confusion that comes with hypothermia made you make bad decisions, let's not think about that. Let's focus on the markers, on counting steps, on the immediate manageable task rather than the larger dangers. 30 steps, 40. You can sense the sight now. Not because there's anything to see, really. The moon is hidden behind clouds, and the stars, which would normally provide at least some ambient light, are distant and cold and don't offer much illumination. But you know it's there because you've internalized the distance, because you've made this walk enough times that your body knows when 50 steps is approaching. It's a kind of kinesthetic memory, your muscles and bones and spatial awareness combining to tell you, we're almost there. 45 steps. The wind suddenly drops, just for a moment. Sometimes that happens in the lee of a ridge, or when the larger weather pattern shifts briefly. The silence is startling after the constant roar of wind. You can hear your own breathing, loud and raspy, vapor condensing and freezing in the air in front of your face. You can hear the slight crunch of snow under your moccasins, a sound that would be pleasant in other contexts, but is just functional right now. 50 steps. You've arrived at the site, the designated area, the place that 3 different locations rotate through, the place that 50 people use, the place that seems like just another patch of snowy ground, but is actually carefully chosen, thoughtfully maintained, essential infrastructure for survival. Now comes the complicated part, the truly difficult part, the part that requires planning and speed, and a kind of determination that most modern people never need to access. You're wearing layer upon layer of clothing. This isn't modern clothing with convenient zippers and elastic waistbands and materials designed for easy removal. This is leather, fur, buckskin, all tied, wrapped, tucked, and secured specifically to keep cold out and warmth in. Getting to the layers underneath requires undoing a system that was designed to be closed, to be secure, to be windproof. The bottom layer is buckskin leggings, tied at the waist with a leather thong. Buckskin is deer hide that's been tanned in a specific way, worked until it's soft and flexible, treated with smoke to make it water resistant. The leggings extend from ankle to waist, providing a continuous layer of protection for your legs. Over that, depending on how cold it is, and tonight is very cold, you might be wearing another layer of leg wraps made from rabbit fur sewn onto a backing of thinner leather. These are wrapped around each leg individually, tied at intervals to keep them from slipping. Then there's your dress if you're a woman, or your breechcloth if you're a man. The dress is a full-body garment made from elk or deer hide, decorated with beadwork or quillwork if your family has the resources and skills, plain if they don't. The breechcloth is simpler, a strip of leather that passes between the legs and is held in place by a belt. Over all of this is your winter coat, which hangs down to your knees, heavy with layers of fur and hide, secured at the waist with another belt to prevent it from flying open in wind. All of this has to be negotiated while standing in the open, while the cold is actively working to freeze any moisture on your skin, while your fingers are losing their ability to grip and untie knots, while every second of delay increases your risk of frostbite. This is where preparation matters. This is where the wisdom of elders like Grandmother Watching really shows itself. This is where you're grateful for the teaching you received as a child, the lessons about how to arrange your clothing so that certain knots are positioned where you can reach them even with cold hands, where layers are ordered so that you can access what you need while exposing as little of yourself as possible for as short a time as possible. Because Here's what the romantic Old West movies never show you. What the history books skip over in their focus on battles and treaties and big events. Exposure in this cold is measured in seconds. 30 seconds with skin exposed to wind chill at 40 below zero, and you've got the beginning of frostbite, tiny ice crystals forming in your cells, tissue starting to freeze from the outside in. 60 seconds, and you've got serious tissue damage, the kind that will hurt for days afterwards, that will leave your skin hypersensitive to cold for the rest of the winter. 2 minutes, and you might lose parts of yourself that you very much want to keep. Fingers, toes, ears, nose. The parts that stick out, that have the most surface area, that are hardest for your body to keep warm. So, this is an exercise in efficiency, in practiced movement, in doing something that should be private and dignified in an environment that is actively hostile to both privacy and dignity, in maintaining humanity and self-respect while your body screams at you about cold and exposure and danger. You squat. That's the position that works best in deep snow. Not sitting, which would put too much of your body in direct contact with the frozen ground, which would conduct heat away from you instantly, which would risk the kind of cold injury that comes from prolonged contact with ice. Not standing, which would be too unstable in snow that might shift under your weight, that might be hiding uneven ground underneath. But squatting, a position that keeps you off the ground while remaining stable. A position that humans have been using for this purpose since we first left the African savanna and spread out across the world, adapting to every climate and terrain. And then you wait for your body to cooperate. Because here's something that doesn't get talked about in survival manuals. Something that's not usually mentioned in academic discussions of historical sanitation. Cold tightens everything. Muscles contract. Blood vessels constrict. Your entire body is in a state of defensive tension, focused on preserving core heat, on protecting vital organs, on ensuring that your heart and lungs and brain maintain the temperature they need to function. Non-essential processes shut down or slow dramatically. Digestion slows. Saliva production decreases. And yes, the muscles that control elimination become reluctant to relax. Because relaxation means vulnerability, means dropping the guard that's keeping you alive. You have to consciously override this. You have to tell your body, relax. Let go. This will be quick. You're safe. The cold won't kill you in the next minute. Trust the process. It's not quick, though. Nothing is quick in January. Your body takes its time, reluctant, resistant, fighting against what you're asking it to do. And while you wait, while you squat there in the frozen darkness, the cold is working. Working on your exposed skin, working on the parts of you that couldn't be covered, working on your resolve, your determination, your willingness to maintain discipline in a situation where discipline feels like punishment. But you've done this before, many times. You know how this works. You know that your body will eventually cooperate, that biology will override reluctance, that relief will come even though it's slower than it would be in warmth. You just have to be patient. Patient and quick at the same time, which is a strange balance, but an essential one. But what if you weren't this prepared? What if this was an emergency, a true crisis where the normal protocols couldn't be followed? Let me tell you about the alternatives, the backup plans for the backup plans, because that's what separates survival from luck. Depth of preparation. You're carrying ash, yes. But what if you'd left the teepee so quickly that you forgot the ash pouch? What if it had fallen off your belt somewhere between here and there, lost in the snow, irretrievable? Would you give up? Would you leave the waste untreated and hope for the best? No, because you were taught alternatives. Snow itself, the dry powder snow that forms in extreme cold, can work in a pinch. Not as well as ash, not nearly as well. But if you pack fresh snow over the waste, if you pack it tightly enough, it creates a barrier. It locks everything underneath, prevents scent from dispersing into the air, gives you enough protection that you can make it back to the teepee and return with ash later before predators are attracted. Or there's frozen earth, if you can find a spot where wind has scoured the snow away. Hard, dry dirt or clay can be crumbled with your hands. Painful in this cold, but possible, and scattered over waste. It doesn't neutralize smell the way ash does. It doesn't kill bacteria, but it covers, it conceals, it buys time, or in the most desperate circumstances, there's urine. Your own urine, if you're able to produce it in this cold. The ammonia in urine, while not as effective as the alkaline compounds in ash, does have some antibacterial properties. It's acidic, yes, but it's also warm, which helps break down the frozen surface of the waste. And it contains urea, which has its own disinfectant qualities. This is knowledge that nobody talks about in polite company. Knowledge that sounds disgusting to modern ears. But this is survival knowledge. This is the unglamorous reality of staying alive when the comfortable options aren't available. And what about the materials you use for cleaning yourself? We talked about moss, about corn husks, about cedar bark. But what if you don't have those? What if your carefully prepared supply ran out, or got wet, or was forgotten in the rush to get outside? Fresh snow again, used carefully, packed into a ball, used quickly before it melts from your body heat. It's abrasive, it's cold, painfully cold, but it works. Or smooth stones if you can find them under the snow. Stones that have been worn by water, that have no sharp edges. The same stones that might be used for covering waste can be used for cleaning, though not the same individual stones, of course. You find new ones, clean ones, stones that are so cold they almost stick to your skin. Or, in the absolute worst case, the edge of your clothing itself, the hem of your dress or breechcloth, material that you're already wearing, that's already against your skin. You use it carefully, knowing that you'll have to clean it later, knowing that this is not ideal but is better than nothing. And when you return to the teepee, you take that garment off immediately. Treat the soiled area with ash and hot water. Hang it close to the fire where the heat will dry it and the smoke will help sterilize it. These are the things that grandmother watching teaches in private, in quiet conversations that happen when curiosity prompts a question. But what if? She doesn't volunteer this information. She doesn't want people thinking that the alternatives are acceptable substitutes for proper preparation. But when asked, she answers honestly, because ignorance is more dangerous than embarrassment. The best tools, she might say, are the ones you prepare in advance. The second best tools are the ones you make from what's available. The third best tools are the ones you improvise from your own body and belongings. But never, ever convince yourself that second best or third best is good enough to excuse lack of preparation. Use the alternatives when you must, but must should be rare. This hierarchy of solutions, this depth of knowledge about how to handle every possible scenario, is what makes the difference between a culture that survives for thousands of years and one that doesn't. It's easy to function when everything goes according to plan. The test comes when plans fail, when circumstances change, when the unexpected happens. That's when depth of knowledge matters. That's when having not just plan A, but plans B through Z becomes the difference between life and death. And so you finish, finally. Your body cooperates. The process completes. You reach for your ash pouch. Grateful, so grateful that you remembered it, that you prepared properly, that you don't have to rely on inferior alternatives tonight. The ash falls on the waste like snow, white on white, covering, concealing, neutralizing. Immediate and effective and beautiful in its simplicity. But the people who lived this life, who made this walk hundreds of times over the course of a winter, hundreds of times over the course of a lifetime, they weren't unprepared. They never were. Because preparation was the difference between life and death. And they knew this not as an abstract principle, but as a concrete, observed reality. They knew it because they'd seen the consequences of lack of preparation. They'd buried the people who thought they could improvise. Remember that fire in the center of the teepee, the one that must never go out, the one that someone is always watching, always feeding, always tending. The fire that represents life itself. It produces something precious, something that modern people throw away without a second thought, something that gets scooped out of fireplaces and grills and thrown in the garbage or spread on gardens without any real understanding of how valuable it is. Ash. You're carrying a small pouch of it right now, tied to your belt under your coat, kept close to your body so that your body heat prevents it from freezing into a solid lump. The pouch was filled this evening, just before sleep, from the edge of the fire pit, where the ash had cooled enough to handle, but was still slightly warm, still carrying residual heat from the wood that produced it. Everyone in the camp does this. Every adult, every older child, anyone who might need to make the walk in the night. Everyone always has a small supply of ash ready, because ash is the key to the entire system. Ash is what makes winter sanitation possible. Ash is what transforms a biological problem into a managed, controlled, safe process. Because ash is magic. Not literally, of course. The elders, like grandmother watching, weren't superstitious in the way that word implies, weren't believers in supernatural forces intervening in the natural world. They understood that ash worked for physical, observable, explicable reasons. They might not have had the vocabulary of chemistry, might not have known terms like pH or alkaline or bacterial inhibition, but they understood the effects. They understood cause and result. They understood that ash did something and that something was essential. But the results were so effective, so immediately obvious, so dramatically better than not using ash, that it felt like magic. It felt like a secret power that humans had discovered. a way to bend the natural world to their needs through knowledge rather than strength. When you finish your business, when your body has finally relaxed enough to let you accomplish what you came out here to do, you reach into that pouch. Your fingers are clumsy with cold, thicker than normal, less responsive than you'd like. But you manage to open the drawstring closure, manage to reach inside, manage to pull out a handful of fine white ash, still slightly warm, even after being carried through the cold night, still retaining some of the fire's gift, still connected to that orange glow back in the teepee. And you sprinkle it, a generous handful, making sure to cover everything, making sure no waste is left exposed to the air, to the cold, to any scavenging animals that might pass through looking for food. Watch what happens. If you had the eyes to see it, if you had instruments that could measure what's happening at the molecular level, you'd see something remarkable. The ash falls on the fresh waste and immediately begins its work. The ash is alkaline, strongly so, with a pH of around 9 or 10 depending on what wood produced it. Cottonwood ash is slightly different from willow ash, which is slightly different from buffalo chip ash. Yes, the dried dung of buffalo, when burned, produces excellent ash for this purpose. Another example of nothing being wasted, everything being useful. But all of them are alkaline. All of them are the chemical opposite of acidic. Human waste is acidic. This is because of the digestive processes, the breakdown of proteins, the production of various acids as byproducts of metabolism. Fresh human waste has a pH of around 6, sometimes lower. Acidic environments are friendly to bacteria. Bacteria thrive in slightly acidic conditions. They multiply. They create odors as they work. They produce compounds that attract flies in warmer weather. But alkaline environments are hostile to bacteria. The pH difference disrupts their cell membranes. It interferes with the proteins they need to function. It essentially turns the environment toxic for most of the bacteria that would normally colonize and break down waste in ways that create disease risk. If you were able to look through a microscope, which won't be commonly available for another 100 years, you'd see bacterial cells dying. Not all of them. Some bacteria are more resistant to pH changes than others, but the vast majority, dead or dormant within minutes of ash contact. But you don't need microscopes to see what's happening. You can observe the immediate visible effects with just your normal senses. First, the smell. Fresh human waste has a sharp, ammonia-like odor. A smell that's instantly recognizable and universally unpleasant. That smell is caused by various nitrogen compounds, volatile molecules that evaporate from the waste into the surrounding air. In warm conditions, this smell can be overwhelming, can carry for impressive distances, can make an area unlivable. When ash hits waste, the smell disappears. Not gradually, not slowly, almost instantly. The alkaline ash reacts with the acidic compounds that create the smell. And through chemical neutralization, those compounds become non-volatile. They're still there, but they're bound up, locked into less reactive forms that don't evaporate, don't smell, don't advertise to every predator within a mile radius that there's biological material here. Second, the texture. Fresh waste is moist, sometimes very moist, depending on diet and hydration. Moisture is a problem in several ways. Moisture spreads. Moisture seeps into surrounding soil. Moisture freezes into awkward, problematic shapes. Moisture, when it thaws in spring, creates exactly the kind of contamination risk that the whole system is designed to prevent. Ash absorbs moisture. It acts like a desiccant, a drying agent, pulling water out of the waste through the same physical principles that make ash good for certain types of construction, certain types of pottery, certain types of soil amendment. The waste becomes drier, more compact, less likely to spread or seep or contaminate. Third, the visibility. White ash covers everything, creating a clean-looking layer between the waste and the world. This isn't just aesthetics, though aesthetics matter. This isn't just making things look better while leaving the problem underneath. The ash layer acts as a barrier, a physical separation that prevents direct contact between the waste and anything else. Animals investigating the site find ash, not waste. Any thawing that might occur during brief warm spells affects ash first, not waste. The ash is a shield, a protective layer. And fourth, though you won't see this for months, though the full effect won't be apparent until spring arrives, the ash contributes to decomposition. When the thaw comes, when temperatures rise, when biological activity resumes at normal speed, that ash provides a neutralizing buffer that allows soil bacteria to work more efficiently. The waste breaks down faster and more completely than if it was left untreated. The soil beneath is actually enriched rather than poisoned. Nitrogen from the waste, neutralized and processed by ash and bacteria, becomes available to plants. The cycle completes. What was waste becomes soil, becomes life again. This is the technology that kept the Great Plains tribes healthy for thousands of years. Not copper pipes that could freeze and burst. Not porcelain toilets that required water systems and waste processing plants. Not chemical treatments that might work well, but poison everything else in the environment. Just wood ash from the fire, applied thoughtfully, used consistently, part of a system that worked with nature rather than trying to dominate it. And here's the thing that strikes me every time I think about this. Every time I try to understand how this knowledge was discovered and refined and passed down. Ash was free. It was produced every single day as a byproduct of staying warm. The fire that kept you alive also produced the material you needed to stay healthy. It was a closed loop, a system where nothing was wasted, where every output from one process became an input for another. But the knowledge of how to use it, when to use it, how much to use, where to apply it, why it worked, that knowledge was precious. That was the real technology. That was what separated tribes that stayed healthy from tribes that didn't. That was what got passed down from grandmother watching to her daughters and sons, from them to their children, generation after generation, refined and tested, and proved over time scales that make modern science look hasty and impatient. The white settlers, when they arrived on the plains a century or so after the time we're visiting, saw Native Americans using ash for sanitation. Some of them documented it in journals and letters, described it with the kind of condescending fascination that colonizers often brought to indigenous practices. They sprinkle ashes on their waste, one letter from the 1830s reports. A curious practice that seems to arise from some primitive belief. Primitive belief, not sophisticated understanding, not centuries of empirical observation, not technology that actually worked better than what the settlers themselves were using. Because the settlers built their outhouses without any treatment system whatsoever. Just holes in the ground, holes that filled up and overflowed and contaminated everything around them. They got sick constantly. Dysentery was endemic in frontier settlements. Cholera swept through again and again. Typhoid killed whole families. These were all diseases that spread through fecal contamination. Diseases that should have been preventable with proper sanitation. Diseases that the Native Americans largely avoided through their primitive beliefs. And the Native Americans watched and wondered, how can a people be so advanced in some ways and so ignorant in others? How can they build such complex tools and weapons and yet not understand something as basic as keeping waste away from water? How can they claim to be bringing civilization when they can't even manage their own shit? It's a question that echoes through history. It's a question we're still asking. What does it mean to be advanced? What does civilization really mean? Is it the ability to make complex machines? Or is it the wisdom to live sustainably, to maintain health, to work with natural systems rather than against them? You finish applying the ash. Your hands are trembling now from the cold, shaking with fine tremors that you can't quite control. You can feel the deep ache in your fingers. That means they've been exposed too long. That means you're approaching the limit of safe exposure time. You need to go back. Need to get back to warmth. Need to restore circulation before damage sets in. But before you go, there's one more thing. A small ritual that grandmother watching taught everyone, that everyone observes even when they're alone, even when no one would know if they skipped it. Even when the cold is screaming at you to hurry up and get inside. A ritual that might seem unnecessary, might seem like wasted motion in a situation where every second matters. But it's not unnecessary. It's essential. Not for physical survival, but for something else. Something harder to quantify, but just as important. You place your hand on the ground, just briefly, just a moment of contact between your palm and the frozen earth beneath the snow. Through your glove, because you're not stupid enough to remove your glove in this cold, you can barely feel anything. Just cold, just hardness, just the sense that the earth is there, solid, real, accepting what you've given it. And you say, quietly, for no one else to hear, not even out loud really, but just in your mind, thank you. Thank you for accepting this. Thank you for processing it. Thank you for turning it back into soil, into nutrients, into life again eventually. Thank you for being patient with us, for allowing us to live here, for not rejecting what we offer. Thank you. The earth doesn't respond, of course. The earth doesn't speak, doesn't show any sign of having heard or cared. But somehow, making that gesture, taking that moment to acknowledge the relationship, to recognize that you're part of a system rather than separate from it, it matters. It reminds you that you're not conquering the earth or dominating nature or imposing your will on the world. You're participating. You're cooperating. You're working with rather than against. This is spiritual practice, not in some abstract mystical sense, but in the very concrete sense that it shapes how you see yourself in the world, how you understand your role, your impact, your responsibility. It's a reminder, repeated hundreds of times over a lifetime, that everything is connected. That waste is part of the cycle, not the end of it. That the earth is generous if you treat it with respect. And with that thought, that moment of gratitude, you start the walk back. 50 steps in reverse, following the willow markers, moving as quickly as you dare, because every second out here is another second that your core temperature drops. Another second closer to the point where cold stops being uncomfortable and becomes dangerous. 20 steps from the teepee, you can see the faint glow of firelight bleeding through the buffalo hide walls. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. Or at least, right now, in this moment, with your body screaming for warmth, with your fingers and face numb, and your feet starting to lose sensation. It feels that way. That faint orange glow represents everything good in the world. Safety, warmth, family, survival. You've never been religious in the way that missionaries would recognize. Your people have spiritual beliefs, certainly. Complex ones, deep ones. Beliefs about how the world works, about the relationship between humans and animals and plants and earth and sky. But those beliefs don't involve worship in the European sense, don't involve prayers to distant gods, don't involve concepts like sin and salvation. But right now, looking at that orange glow, you understand why some people pray. You understand the impulse to express gratitude to something, anything, for the fact that warmth exists, that shelter exists, that you're about to transition from the world of cold into the world of fire. If you were going to pray, this would be the moment. This would be the feeling that generated prayer, overwhelming relief, bone-deep gratitude, the sense that survival is somehow miraculous, even though it's also perfectly ordinary. The thing about cold, real cold, the kind that wants to kill you, the kind that will kill you if you give it enough time, is that it changes your relationship with fire, changes it fundamentally and permanently. In summer, fire is just useful. It cooks food, which is important. It provides light after sunset, which is convenient. It keeps certain kinds of animals away, which is prudent. But summer fire is optional in a sense. You could survive without it if you had to. You could eat raw food. You could function in darkness. You could manage without its protection. But in winter transforms fire into something approaching the sacred, into something essential in a way that goes beyond utility. Fire in winter is the difference between being human and being frozen meat. It's that stark, that absolute, that non-negotiable. Every teepee has its fire in the exact center, and this placement isn't arbitrary. The teepees of the Plains tribes, and variations of this design across many northern tribes, are masterpieces of thermal engineering, though no one in the tribe would call them that. They just call them teepees, lodges, homes. But they represent centuries of experimentation and refinement. Centuries of testing what works and discarding what doesn't. Centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to create a shelter that can keep humans alive in conditions that should make that impossible. The cone shape is essential. It's not just aesthetically pleasing, though it is that. It's not just structurally strong against wind, though it is that too. The cone shape creates a natural chimney effect, a convection current that's the key to the whole system. Hot air rises. This is basic physics, observable without instruments, something that humans figured out as soon as we started paying attention to how fire and air interact. Hot air is less dense than cold air, so it rises naturally, pushed up by the denser cold air sinking beneath it. In a cone-shaped teepee with a fire at the center, the hot air and smoke rise straight up toward the peak, toward the smoke hole that's always there at the top. Always open, even in the worst weather, even in the coldest nights. Open because it has to be. Because without that opening, smoke would fill the teepee, would choke everyone inside, would make the space unlivable. That rising hot air and smoke create negative pressure at the base of the teepee. As air leaves through the top, more air has to enter at the bottom to replace it. This incoming air enters through the deliberate gap between the ground and the bottom edge of the hide covering. The hide doesn't go all the way to the ground. It's held down by stones, yes, to keep it from flapping in wind. But there's a gap, a controlled opening all the way around the circumference. Cold, fresh air flows in through this gap, drawn by the negative pressure, and then immediately moves toward the fire, drawn by the heat differential. This continuous circulation means the air inside is never stagnant, never oxygen depleted, never filled with the carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide that would build up in a sealed space with a fire burning. The liner, that inner wall of hide that hangs from the lodge poles, about 5 or 6 feet up from the ground, is the real genius element. The liner isn't decorative. It's not about privacy or aesthetics. It's functional, critically functional, serving multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it creates a pocket of air between itself and the outer wall. That pocket, that 6-inch or 8-inch gap of trapped air, acts as insulation. Air is one of the best insulators that exists, better than most solid materials. That's why wool works, why feathers work, why hollow hairs work. They trap air in countless tiny pockets, and those pockets slow the transfer of heat. The double wall of the teepee works the same way. Heat from the fire can't just conduct directly through to the outside. It has to cross that air gap, and in crossing, it loses energy, slows down, stays inside longer. Second, and more cleverly, the liner directs the incoming cold air up and away from the people sleeping. Remember that cold air entering through the gap at the bottom? Without the liner, that cold air would flow across the floor, creating a river of freezing air right where people are trying to sleep. But the liner intercepts it, forces it up toward the fire before it can spread across the floor. The cold air rises along the inside of the outer wall, gets heated by the fire, and then circulates through the living space. By the time it reaches the sleeping areas, it's been warmed, made comfortable, rendered harmless. Inside, a well-maintained teepee in the dead of winter, while outside the wind is howling at 50 miles per hour, and the temperature is 40 below zero, and the wind chill is something approaching 60 below. The temperature at ground level where people sleep might be 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes even warmer, maybe 50 degrees if the fire is burning well and there are enough bodies adding their warmth. 40 degrees, that's above freezing. That's cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to want blankets and furs. But compared to 40 below, that's an 80-degree difference. 80 degrees of separation between survival and death, created by nothing more than hide and poles and fire and understanding of how air moves. You reach the entrance flap and work it open. Movements clumsy because your fingers have lost most of their dexterity. The leather thongs that secure the flap are stiff with cold, and your hands don't want to cooperate. You fumble with the knot, cursing internally, aware that you're burning precious seconds, that frostbite doesn't wait for you to figure out knots. This is dangerous. This is one of those moments where people get hurt, not from the big dramatic things, but from small failures at critical moments. Frostbite doesn't hurt at first. That's one of its cruelest tricks. The affected area goes numb. And you think that's fine. That's just cold. That's normal. By the time you feel pain, by the time the burning and aching starts, the damage is already done. Tissue has frozen. Ice crystals have formed in cells, puncturing cell walls, destroying structure. What will follow is days or weeks of pain as the damaged tissue tries to heal, or, in severe cases, dies and has to be removed. Fingers are especially vulnerable. Toes, too. But you can't see your toes right now, can't monitor them. Fingers you can watch, can see the color changing from normal to white, first stage frostbite, to waxy yellow, second stage to gray or black, third stage tissue death, amputation likely. Right now, your fingers are white. You can see that even in the darkness. White and numb and clumsy. You need to get inside, need to get them warm. Now. Finally, the knot gives. The flap opens. You push through, and the second flap, the inner layer, and then inside. Finally, inside. The wall of warm air hits your face like a physical thing, like walking into an invisible barrier that's soft and yielding, but definitely there. The temperature differential is shocking, overwhelming, almost painful in its intensity. Your nose starts running immediately as the frozen mucus inside melts, suddenly and messily. Your ears begin that terrible burning ache that comes with rapid warming, that sensation that's worse than cold, that makes you want to scream except you don't, because that would wake everyone. Your fingers, as they start to regain feeling, hurt worse than they did when they were frozen. This is called the screaming barfies by modern mountaineers, crude slang for an experience that's genuinely awful. The burning, tingling, nauseating pain of rapidly warming extremities. Your hands feel like they're being stabbed by thousands of tiny needles. They burn and ache and throb, and you have to fight the urge to cry out, have to clench your jaw and breathe through it, and wait for the pain to subside. But you're alive. You're safe. You made the walk, followed the protocols, did what needed to be done. You're back in the world of warmth, in the world of family, in the space that humans have carved out of winter, through effort and knowledge and careful attention to detail. Your family members are still sleeping. Your younger brother hasn't moved. Your baby sister is making soft sounds in her sleep, small squeaks and sighs that mean she's dreaming about something, some infant concern or comfort. Your mother has shifted slightly, repositioned herself, but her breathing is still deep and steady. Your father is still by the fire, still feeding it, still performing his duty. He glances at you as you come in, doesn't say anything, doesn't need to, just a look that says, "You're back, you're safe, good." And then he returns his attention to the fire, to the careful addition of one more small piece of cottonwood, to the maintenance of this orange glow that makes everything else possible. The fire has burned down slightly while you were gone, but there are still good coals, still plenty of heat radiating from the center. You add a few small pieces of wood to it, nursing it back to a proper flame. Not too much wood, never too much at once. Fuel conservation is critical in winter, and even though you've made it through another successful trip, even though everything went well, you can't be wasteful. Every piece of wood has to be considered, has to be used thoughtfully. What you have is what you have. There's no resupply coming. There's no store to visit. There's no magical solution if you run out. You settle back into your furs, carefully removing your winter coat and hanging it on its designated pole, arranging it so it will dry properly if any snow melted on it. You remove your moccasins and check your feet. They're cold, but not frozen. Toes are pink, healthy color. No white spots that would indicate frostbite. Good. You wiggle them, getting blood flowing again, welcoming the pins and needles sensation that means nerves are working. That means everything is okay. The warmth that had seemed so intense when you first entered, so overwhelming that it was almost uncomfortable, now feels gentle, perfect, just right. Your body begins to relax, to release the tension of the walk, of the exposure, of the risk. Your muscles unclench. Your breathing slows. The adrenaline that was keeping you alert and moving starts to fade, replaced by a drowsy contentment. You burrow back into your furs, into the nest of buffalo and deer and rabbit that's still warm from your earlier presence, still holding some of your body heat from before you left. It feels like a gift, like the furs are welcoming you back, and lying there, drifting towards sleep, feeling the warmth seep back into your bones, you think about the system you just participated in, the centuries of observation and experimentation that went into choosing that location, that distance, those specific protocols, the accumulated wisdom of all those winters, all those people who learned through success and failure how to survive in a landscape that forgives nothing, that gives no second chances. The white ash is probably already doing its work out there at the site, neutralizing, drying, covering, protecting the earth, protecting the water, protecting the community from diseases that could wipe out everyone, that could turn winter from a survivable hardship into a death sentence. And come spring, when the snow melts and the site is revealed, there will be nothing there that shouldn't be. The earth will have processed it, broken it down through bacterial action and chemical transformation, incorporated it back into the cycle of nutrients and growth. The tribe will move to summer grounds, following the buffalo, following the sun, following the patterns that have sustained them for longer than anyone can remember. and the winter camp will gradually disappear, absorbed back into the prairie, leaving almost no trace that anyone was ever there. This is the part that modern people struggle to understand. We think in terms of permanence. We build things that last, things that endure for decades or centuries. We mark our territory. We leave monuments. We make sure everyone knows we were here. But the Native Americans of the Great Plains understood something different. They understood that the earth wasn't theirs to mark. They weren't owners. They were guests, temporary inhabitants, participants in a system much larger and much longer lived than any individual or tribe or generation. And good guests clean up after themselves. Good guests leave no trace. Good guests respect the home they're visiting. The last thing you remember before sleep takes you is the sound of the wind outside, still testing the teepee's defenses, still pushing against the careful construction of hide and pole and human ingenuity. But inside, you're warm. You're safe. You followed the old ways, the tested ways, the ways that work. And that, ultimately, is what survival is. Not heroics, not daring, not improvisation or clever solutions thought up on the spot, but careful attention to detail, respect for proven methods, adherence to protocols that have been refined over generations, and the wisdom to know that you are never, ever smarter than 10,000 years of collective human experience. Sleep comes easily now. Deep, restful sleep. The sleep of someone who has faced the cold and returned victorious. The sleep of someone who knows that they did everything right, that they maintained discipline, that they honored the wisdom of elders and the lessons of history. Tomorrow there will be other challenges. Tomorrow the wind might be worse, or the food supply might need attention, or the horses might have some issue that needs resolution. Tomorrow will have its own demands, its own tests. But tonight, you survived. You made the walk. You followed the protocols. You're warm and safe and whole. And that's enough. That's everything. So, here we are, at the end of our journey together. You're still in your comfortable home, in your warm bed. The story I've told you happened 250 years ago, in a world that no longer exists to people whose names we'll never know. But the principles remain. The challenges remain. We still generate waste. We still need to manage it. We still depend on water and earth and natural systems to process what we can't use. And we still make choices every day about whether to follow the harder but wiser path, or to take shortcuts that feel easier in the moment but cost more in the long run. The 50 steps through the January darkness. That's a metaphor for so many things in life, isn't it? The difficult thing you need to do, the inconvenient truth you need to face, the hard path that leads to better outcomes. Every generation faces this choice. Not about winter sanitation specifically, but about something. Some area where the easy path and the right path diverge. How do we choose? What do we base our decisions on? The people I've told you about tonight, they based their choices on accumulated wisdom, on observation, on understanding consequences, on respect for systems they depended on. We could do worse than to follow their example. I said at the beginning, that this was a story about intelligence, about observation, about wisdom. I hope I've shown you that it's true, that the Native Americans who faced January on the Great Plains weren't surviving in spite of their methods, but because of them. That what looked primitive to outside observers was actually sophisticated. That what seemed simple was actually profound. And I hope, maybe, that you'll think of grandmother watching and her 50-step walk the next time you face a hard choice. The next time you're tempted to take a shortcut. The next time you wonder if the protocols really matter. They matter. The earth accepts what we give with respect, and winter, patient teacher that it is always ready to remind us of that lesson. Thank you for journeying with me tonight, for listening, for imagining, for being willing to step back through time and experience a world so different from ours. May your own night be warm. May your own path be clear. And may you always have the wisdom to walk the full 50 steps, even when it's hard. Sleep well. And remember, spring always comes, eventually, if we can just hold on through the cold. Good night.